and welcome everyone. Thank you for spending some time with us today. Today, Robin and I will be speaking a bit about VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, in celebration, commemoration, anticipation of its upcoming anniversary. And we'll also be talking a bit about the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence and the work that the Commission does on behalf of attorneys representing survivors of domestic and sexual violence, dating violence, and stalking across the country. This conversation is part of the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice's Chair Chat initiative. We are so grateful to the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice for inviting us to participate in this conversation. And today, Robin and I are serving as your guest co-host and guest conversationalist. Friday, September 13th, will mark the 30th anniversary of the initial passage of VAWA. So during this chat today, we'll provide a little information and background of VAWA and some of the services that VAWA funds, what it means for survivors, as well as lawyers. I'll introduce myself first. My name is Jane Zai. I am a managing attorney with the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence, one of CRSJ's peer entities in the Center for Public Interest Law at the American Bar Association. Our commission provides free training and technical assistance, which is just a fancy way of saying individualized support to civil attorneys representing survivors of gender-based violence at organizations across the country. I will provide additional information later in the talk about some of our projects and some of the resources we have. Our commission is funded by the U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women to provide the support to LAV grantees. LAV stands for Legal Assistance for Victims. Many of the grantees that we provide training and technical assistance to are attorneys at legal aid offices, nonprofit organizations, as well as other attorneys who provide free civil services to survivors. I've been with the ABA for the last 7.5 years. Before that, I worked at 2 different legal aid offices where I provided direct representation to survivors in domestic relations cases, domestic violence cases. I organized legal clinics, and I also did some pro bono coordinating. One of the grants I was funded under for a time was the Justice for Families project, which, like the LAV project, is another VAWA funded project. I will now pass it over to the very brilliant Robin Turner, who I used to have the privilege of working with on the same team and who we miss very much at the ABA.
Thanks, Jane. I miss you too. I'm so excited to work with Jane today again on this chair chat, and really appreciate CRSJ for bringing the voices of survivors to this platform. We appreciate it. So I'm now Policy and Litigation Counsel at Legal Voice. Legal Voice is an organization that believes that all people facing gender discrimination should be able to live their lives with dignity, safety, and autonomy. And the organization lives those values through work in policy, litigation, and community building in a variety of areas. That includes gender-based violence, healthcare access, reproductive freedom, gender discrimination, and economic justice. Our organization works in Washington, Idaho, and Montana. And being from Montana, I am the attorney now who is working back in Montana on those issues. But I most recently worked with Jane at the ABA, where I was senior attorney collaborating on a lot of the projects that Jane's going to talk about later, and really enjoyed that work and the work we got to do with attorneys on behalf of survivors. Finally, for most of my legal career, I've been a policy advocate or an attorney for survivors of gender-based violence, represented survivors of gender-based violence in state courts and in tribal courts in Montana for well over a decade. I worked on family law, victim rights, employment, orders of protection, any type of civil legal services that I was qualified to provide that would help survivors in their quest for peace and safety for their families. So thanks for having me.
Robin, let's jump right in and talk
All right,
about
let's do it.
VAWA. What is the Violence Against Women Act?
So we are celebrating the Violence Against Women Act, and we'll be calling it VAWA from time to time. That's what we're talking about. It's federal legislation that was passed by Congress in 1994, which worked to improve community and system responses to gender-based violence. And when we talk about gender-based violence, we are generally talking about domestic violence, sexual violence, dating violence, and stalking. Really, VAWA redefined what had often been cast aside as a family problem or a private affair as an act that actually harms our families and harms our communities and our societies. And so through this, VAWA proposed to invest in solutions and to respond to the incidents of gender-based violence in our country. They did that through grant projects and through changes to federal statutes. And this law has been reauthorized 4 times by Congress in 2000, 2005, 2013, and 2022. So Jane's going to get a little bit more in depth of some of the services that the ABA provides under VAWA, but just generally, VAWA provides funding mechanisms for a variety of services to survivors, should enhance federal, tribal, state, and local responses. Those include housing programs like transitional housing for survivors, rural programs, and under-resourced communities, sexual assault services, criminal legal responses, and civil legal assistance for victims throughout the country. When I think about the Violence Against Women Act and how it comes up the most in my work, even in the work I'm doing now at a program that's not funded by the Violence Against Women Act, I think about confidentiality and its role in empowerment of survivors. Under the guidance of VAWA, any organization that receives funding for their work has to protect survivors' personally identifying information, and they can't share it without informed consent. There's a few exceptions to the rule, but generally, attorneys like Jane and I, advocates, non-attorneys who work with survivors are instructed to provide confidential services. And I think a lot about when I'm training folks and doing the work myself, why this matters. That's for a few reasons. It allows for accurate safety planning and support. When a survivor knows that the information they share is not going to be shared with others, there's an opportunity for them to disclose about abuse if they're not concerned about it coming back and harming them. It enhances survivor safety because disclosure could escalate the violence. It preserves survivor dignity. They're able to regain control of their lives and their safety, which has been taken away from them slowly through the abuse. When I practice, we talk about the roles between the attorney and the client. And I'd share with my client that my role was to understand the law, to advise on legal strategy, and to keep safety in mind. But really the realm of the survivor was to be the expert on their safety, their experience, and their ultimate goals. And therefore, like, confidential conversations and protections of privacy were an essential component of our partnership. And I really think that's an essential part of the Violence Against Women Act and some of the guidance that they provide to organizations who use services funded by the Violence Against Women Act. So we're going to transition into that to talk a little bit about those legal projects, including the legal assistance for victims projects. And so Jane, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about how LAV and other funding mechanisms help survivors individually, and how does it help those who work with survivors?
I'll start by saying that generally speaking, the right to counsel is not extended to litigants in civil cases. I think a lot of people find that surprising since there is usually a lot at stake for survivors and other individuals who are at risk of losing substantial rights, especially when they're unrepresented. I'm going to talk about a few different studies that address the issue, the access to justice gap. The ABA Commission on the Future of Legal Services conducted a study that found that in some jurisdictions, more than 80% of litigants living in poverty were unrepresented in cases that involved basic life needs. So that's a backdrop where the reality of many low-income survivors, and for many survivors, the violence that they experienced is not their only issue. There's a study that was conducted by LSC, which is the Legal Services Corporation, for one of their recent Justice Gap reports that found that 98% of households with survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault had at least one additional civil legal problem unrelated to the violence, which is truly astounding. It's almost 100%. This is why in many of our trainings, we talk about holistic legal services and the importance of asking survivors themselves what will be most helpful for them, which is something you just mentioned. What are their long-term and short-term goals, and how do survivors themselves define success? Their answer might be surprising to attorneys. So while LAV funding and other funding does not solve the issue of access to justice, it does provide meaningful funding to increase the availability of legal assistance for survivors of domestic violence, sexual violence, dating violence, and stalking. For example, in 2023, the LAV program gave out 55 awards that totaled nearly $40 million. The Office on Violence Against Women does lay out some purpose areas and priority areas that recipients are encouraged to include. And then there are also requirements. Applicants are required to explain how their projects will incorporate confidentiality, as you had mentioned, Robin, and safety planning and informed consent. Notably, the LAV program doesn't just fund attorneys to provide representation in domestic violence order protection cases. It provides funding for, quote, comprehensive direct legal services, meaning that attorneys might be representing clients in immigration cases, employment, administrative agency cases, housing matters, and even some limited criminal related matters. This is important because, again, a survivor might be coming to your office presenting one issue, but actually needs help, both legal help and non-legal help, to rebuild and repair the areas of their lives that will enable them to continue their lives after the legal case has concluded. There is another study that you introduced me to, Robin, that I literally talk about all the time. It's a study conducted by the Full Frame Initiative that examines how survivors define success. So legal providers and survivors have such different views of what constitutes success. While attorneys are understandably focused on legal victories, survivors are absolutely not focusing on services that they have received. I will make a quick note here that trauma-informed representation is a critical component of working with survivors. Our commission has a trauma-informed representation project where we are looking at both providing trauma-informed client-centered legal services to survivors, as well as looking at how organizations, in particular direct service organizations serving survivors, can be more trauma-informed with an eye toward mitigating the effects of secondary trauma or burnout that so often affects attorneys who are working in the field of gender-based violence, and thinking about how do we retain attorneys in this work. I'll end by saying that I think that there are a few provisions in LAV funding that also look at retaining attorneys in the work, which, as we all know, is very difficult work. One is requiring funded projects to participate in trauma-informed representation training. Another requirement is a supervision and mentoring plan for project attorneys, which includes that attorneys with less than 5 years of experience, those attorneys must be supervised by a licensed attorney who has more experience. The importance of supervision and mentoring, I think, can't be understated in the types of cases the attorneys we're working with are taking on. There are so many other things we could talk about right now around supervision, such as ensuring that staff have manageable caseloads. That's something we hear about a lot, and connection points to debrief difficult case matters. But we won't get into that now, but I will highlight that under our trauma-informed representation project, we will be having an upcoming Connect and Learn session on trauma-informed supervision, and we are also in the process of developing an institute on trauma-informed legal organizations. I will now pass it back over to you, Robin. VAWA, you said, was originally passed in 1994, and there have been reauthorizations in 2000, 2005, 2013, and 2022. Can you explain how VAWA has changed over the years?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And just thinking about what you were saying about trauma informed and thinking about the ways we look at attorney caseloads. Certainly my experience is not the only experience in the world for attorneys, but I know that many of us, the first time we heard about trauma informed representation or secondary trauma was probably when we were pretty close to burnout. And I just think it's so powerful and exciting that through watching the work that attorneys have been doing with survivors, there's a recognition that attorneys are also impacted by the things we see, by witnessing the abuse that our clients experience, by potentially being survivors ourselves and how that's impacted, and that our work and these federal statutes are adjusting to ensure that people are being cared for and valued as members of the profession. So thanks for pointing that out. But from the beginning, VAWA has provided access to legal services in new ways. I thought about my first job after I finished clerking after law school, and it was with a nonprofit in Northwest Montana. It was on the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribal Nation. We had 2 attorneys on staff that were funded by the Violence Against Women Act. I personally focused on tribal court, and I was doing family law and orders of protection, and my colleague focused on the state courts. And just given the unique nature of jurisdiction in our community, my client might be able to utilize state court or tribal court, or state court for one issue, tribal court for another issue. And so we were able to work closely together to ensure that the survivor and the jurisdiction that was over their case wasn't going to impact the quality of services they received. And that was always something that I found to be a really powerful lesson early on in doing work with survivors. But in a lot of ways, each reauthorization each year has reflected the ways our movement has changed. Certainly, we need to keep changing. It continues to be our work to push back and push towards serving survivors who are underserved and most significantly impacted by our systems and by those who cause them harm. We have a lot to do, but I do want to cover a few areas where VAWA has provided relief for survivors. So the very first iteration of VAWA in 1994 created provisions that would allow survivors to self-petition for immigration relief. So now survivors who were dependent upon spouses who were citizens, or spouses who had lawful permanent resident status or LPR status, can petition on their own, which thereby takes away one source of power and control in the relationship, where the abuser is saying, I will get you deported, or I will take the kids away and you will be sent home. Those sorts of things. There's now some sort of relief in immigration law to allow folks to remain safe. In 2000, VAWA reauthorization created new forms of immigration relief like the U visa, that's for non-citizens who've experienced violent crime, and T visas for victims of sexual assault or trafficking. So, and as Jane mentioned earlier, the ABA works with attorneys who take on these types of cases, take on family law and immigration cases. They're essential forms of relief for survivors, and those have come through the mechanism of VAWA reauthorizations. The second topic I'll speak to is non-discrimination. So we know, those of us who do the work know that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender survivors of violence often experience systemic bias, prevents them from receiving the services to which they should be entitled. And their experiences are often left out of mainstream understanding of gender-based violence, which can sometimes lead to bias and stigma when seeking help. So in 2013, VAWA created federal protections for transgender survivors in shelter services, and prohibited discrimination in all services based upon actual or perceived sex, gender identity, or sexual orientation. And another project of the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence is the Legal Access Project for LGBTQIA survivors. We'll be sure to send a link so that you can see some of the great work that that project has done with attorneys. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention tribal jurisdiction. So given inconsistent racist policies of the federal government and the effects of colonization, many tribal courts in the United States have been unable to prosecute non-native abusers for domestic and sexual violence actions. So instead, the federal government, or in some circumstances, states, were responsible for that prosecution. Under the 2013 and 2022 reauthorizations, the Violence Against Women Act has recognized the inherent authority of tribal governments who want to voluntarily exercise special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction over non-tribal members if they commit a variety of acts against intimate partners or their family members in their communities. So, like I said, always work to do. Systems are not necessarily always responsive to survivors, and I think we can all agree legal systems can be challenging, adversarial process can be difficult, and it can be utilized against survivors, but the Violence Against Women Act kind of combines protections for folks, particularly those who've been vulnerable in those ways, and also allows for an attorney to stand at the side of the survivor and fight with them. And so that's really a powerful one-two impact. So I know Jane wants to get a little bit more into the ABA and some of the other projects and work we do. So Jane, take it away. Tell us more about that VAWA work.
Thank you so much, Robin, for sharing about the history of VAWA and what it's meant for survivors nationwide over the last 30 years. You have so much knowledge, and I really appreciate learning from you and having this conversation with you today. Both Robin and I have mentioned a few different projects that the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence is working on. We currently have 2 LGBTQ+ projects, a legal access project where we are providing training and technical assistance to civil attorneys, prosecutors, and the judiciary on issues arising from intimate partner violence and sexual assault in LGBTQ+ communities. Our second LGBTQ+ project focuses on providing training to domestic and sexual violence coalitions across the country. As we talked about before, we have a trauma-informed representation project that again focuses both on ensuring representation of survivors, is client-centered, client-led, and trauma-informed. Robin and I worked a great deal together on that project and offering best practices and guidance for legal services organizations to be more trauma-informed as well. So if you visit the Commission's website, which is www.americanbar.org/CDSV, you can access these project pages, as well as learn more about resources we are developing and upcoming webinars and institutes. To keep in touch with the Commission, I encourage everyone to sign up for one of our listservs. We have 6 different listservs, including our Litigate listserv for attorneys who represent survivors in litigation, in court, and not just in family law cases and domestic violence law cases, but from other practice settings as well. We have a managed listserv for managers and supervisors, and we often send information about upcoming trainings and newly developed resources through our listservs. Finally, I will mention again that we can also provide individualized support to attorneys and organizations on a wide variety of matters. Some examples are ensuring that your intake process and intake forms are inclusive. We can offer help reviewing your legal services agreement or retainer agreement, and review other policies and procedures to ensure that they are trauma-informed and promote safety on behalf of clients. So again, our website is www.americanbar.org/CDSB, where you can contact us through our technical assistance form. And I will turn it back to Robin to talk about how to reach her at Legal Voice. You're muted, Robin.
If you're interested in hearing more about the work we do at Legal Voice, particularly in the Pacific Northwest and Montana, the impact litigation we work on, the policy advocacy, and the community building that we hope to do on different topics, including gender-based violence, reproductive freedom, healthcare access, and discrimination, feel free to reach out to us at our website, www.legalvoice.org. I'm happy to share more, but really, truly, I hope that you will continue to follow the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence as well, particularly if you're working individually with survivors. It's an incredible resource. Those listservs are a great way to connect with people all around the country who do this work and might be a listening ear for you. I know I've met many wonderful professionals through the work and through being able to share experiences and get advice on where to turn next. So thanks again. I want to thank Jane for chatting with me, and thanks to CRSJ, the Civil Rights and Social Justice section, for hosting us today.